Before we begin Mass, we often like to talk about the saints that we celebrate as a church. Who is it that we celebrate every January the 26th as a church? Every January the 26th we celebrate Saints Timothy and Titus. Have we heard those names before? Where do we hear the names Timothy and Titus? Timothy and Titus are both books in the Bible, in the New Testament. And so there are letters that were purportedly written by St. Paul to Timothy and to Titus, though Scripture scholars no longer believe that St. Paul wrote those letters. So we refer to them as pseudonymous letters, meaning someone wrote them in St. Paul's name, and in St. Paul's spirit, and in St. Paul's authority, but it wasn't St. Paul who wrote them. So they're the letters of Timothy and Titus. Who were these people to whom these letters were written? First, St. Timothy. St. Timothy was a fellow apostle of Paul. So in the Acts of the Apostles, we have it talking about how it is that Timothy was a partner of St. Paul. He came from an interesting mix in his family because his father was Greek and his mother was Jewish. So how did the Jews see him? He came from a mixed marriage, which was not such a favorable thing back then, right? Father was Greek, mother, Eunice, was Jewish. Actually, the first one in the family to become Christian was his grandmother. Grandma Lois became Christian first, and then Timothy would later convert to Christianity. Because he had a Greek father, was he circumcised like the Jews? No, he was not circumcised. But in order for him to be acceptable to the Jews, to be able to preach to the Jews, what are we guessing St. Paul insisted on? That he be circumcised. Oh, poor guy. Interesting, because we're going to see a contrast. In Timothy and Titus, Paul did not insist that Titus be circumcised, but he did for Timothy, so that Timothy would be accepted by the Jews. Lucky Timothy. So Timothy joined Paul's missionary work, traveled with Paul for some 15 years. We have a record of Timothy knowing St. Paul. He was a faithful and trusted friend. We know that he was with St. Paul during his time of house arrest in Rome. We all know that St. Paul was under house arrest in Rome. And so St. Timothy, we know, was part of that, was with Paul during that time. He was Paul's representative to the church in Ephesus. A few other things we know about Timothy come from the letters to Timothy. One, we believe that Timothy was young. Why do we believe that? Because in the first letter to Timothy it says, "Let no one have contempt for your youth." Would the author write that to an older person? No. So obviously we think that Timothy was younger. We think that Timothy was more timid, but also that Timothy had a weaker state of health. St. Paul, for instance, writes to Timothy, he says, "Stop drinking only water." So we get this picture of Timothy only drinking water. St. Paul tells him, "But have a little wine for the sake of your stomach." It's for that reason that today St. Timothy is known as the patron saint of what?
Wine?
Stomach disorders. Wine? Good guess.
Wine sounded
I
better.
wonder if the church has a patron saint of wine. Right? So, St. Timothy is the patron saint of stomach disorders in the church due to that line in the first letter to Timothy. Titus was Greek, and we believe that he was from Antioch, which is in modern-day Turkey. Interesting, as we said before, while Paul insisted that Timothy be circumcised, Titus got off. And so Paul didn't let him undergo circumcision. We get the image in the second letter to the Corinthians that Titus was a dear friend of Paul. Paul says, for instance, "When I went to Troas, I had no relief in my spirit because I did not find my brother Titus." So it suggests that he was inconsolable at not finding Titus there. But then when Titus finally came to him, he said, "God encouraged us by the arrival of Titus." So it gives us this image of this person who brightened Paul's day by Paul knowing that he was okay in his travels. Titus, according to the letter to Titus, was the administrator of the Christian community in Crete, was in charge of organizing it and correcting abuses and appointing presbyter bishops to watch over the community. It's one of the first references that we have to presbyters or elders. Today we know them as priests in the church. So every January the 26th, we celebrate Timothy and Titus as a church.